All right, welcome. We are live. We're trying out a new thing here, basically. Um, don't never really done the call-in shows before, but it's good as time as any. So, welcome. I am Dr. Khalil Andani, and I've decided to just create this little corner for open theological discussion. Never really done these things before, but there's always a good time to start. So here we go. We're not going to really have a super structured discussion right now, unless somebody comes up. But basically, some of my interests are Islamic philosophy. I work in Islamic history, Islamic philosophy. As an assistant professor of religion, I also teach multiple religious traditions: Islam, Christianity, a little bit of Hinduism, a little bit of Judaism as well. So my responsibilities include teaching world religions, basically. But I think it's important to have a theological dialogue, in a sense. And I've never really run one of these streams before myself, so this is the first time I'm running it. And I thought it would just be a good place to invite people to come and have any type of theological conversation that they want to have. My camera is not on because I'm sort of doing other things, but I'm going to keep this space open for people who want to join the conversation. Hello, mythological beast. Thank you for the shout outs. You can come in if you want. Anybody can come in. We can have a little powwow if we want to do that. Just playing around with this thing. Oh, cool. So, yeah, the floor is open for anyone who wants to come and have a chat. If you're on Twitter right now, it's quite entertaining. I can even put my Twitter on the screen. You can sort of see what's going on. But basically, there's always some sort of hot theological discussion going on Twitter. Right now, it's between me and some Salafis. Again, always entertaining. And, I think Salafis, who seem to be the most active group on Twitter, from what I can tell, it's fun to give them a little bit of pushback. Oh, how do you join? That is a great question. I shared a link on Twitter, but let me share it here. So let's see here. Invite, copy. I believe I can just join. All right, so I've posted the StreamYard link in the chat for those of you who just check the live chat if you're listening. I don't know if there's a way to like spotlight that particular comment. Let's see here.
I don't know if there's a way to.
So it's in there. So you guys are welcome to join in. Again, we're gonna have sort of a low key, relaxed conversation. Not really time to have a debate, at least not right now. But there can be other times to have more debates. But we put a link in the chat. But yeah, Twitter is very interesting right now. Salafi dominated Twitter. K Qasim, Ya Ali Madad, Mola Ali Madad. Best way to contact me is email. I have several email addresses. If you just Google me, you'll get my email address. But what tends to happen is I get overwhelmed with emails, and sometimes I just miss emails. It just happens. So if I don't reply to you, please don't be offended. It's probably because I checked the email when I was already very busy with a bunch of other things. So that's probably why. But email is the best way, basically, to contact me. Use banners. Create a banner. Oh, I can make a banner. Let me try to create a banner. Oh, okay. Yeah, so, here we go. We have someone who's joined. Hello, mythological beast. Welcome to my first hosted call-in show. How are you?
Oh, by the grace of God, I'm doing very well, Dr. Andani. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm just having a relaxing evening. I thought while I'm grading and doing other things, I could host one of these things. I do want to have a sustainable forum for theological and philosophical dialogue that is not polemical, but honest. I find that polemics where you're just trying to score points is sort of useless. But I do believe that people with differing worldviews should get to chat about them and interact with each other.
Oh,
So
definitely.
tell us, what do you want to share anything about your perspectives, worldviews, anything like that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And by the way, sorry, I accidentally spoke over you, Doctor. I didn't mean to.
No, don't worry. That's bound to happen all the time. I've probably been speaking over you.
But yeah, before I begin, I just want to properly say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I'm actually a big fan of your work ever since you've debated some, you know, people. You did a wonderful job. I was very impressed. And yeah, you made a whole bunch of people proud with that. I was very impressed with your quotations and your knowledge of these facts, and you are one of the people who inspire me. So thank you for all that you do. Um,
Well,
with
that's
me,
very kind of you to say. So thank you.
oh,
That's very,
definitely. I wouldn't
very.
say it if it wasn't true. But yeah, I myself, I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, Greek Orthodox specifically, because that's where my family's from. And yeah, I really love Trinitarian theology because I'm sure you know because I believe you're friends with Dr. Bo Branson. Um,
Yes, yes.
yes, our perspective is called monarchia, monarchy of the Father. Um, and if you want me to speak about that for a little bit, I'm sure you know what it is. But if you want me to
Yeah,
speak about it,
please. Yeah, I mean, I know, or at least I would say I have a very rudimentary understanding of it, based on what Bo has said, and I think I've read a couple of papers on the Saint Gregory's, um, and it's claimed, or it's argued that they were proponents of this view. So I have a working knowledge of it, enough to teach the basics to my students. So we actually spoke about this today very briefly.
oh,
Um, I
nice.
basically wanted them to learn three Trinity models: so monarchy, relative identity, and social.
Hmm.
Because when I was in university, I didn't even know this existed. So,
Yeah,
but yeah, please
yeah.
go ahead. I'm not here to sort of teach or professor. I'm really here to listen, and I might ask you questions and whatever. But go ahead, and while you do, I'll add these other. Well, before you do, just give me 1 minute. I'm going to add a couple others to our stream. So we have Dark Templar and Brethren of Purity. Dark Templar, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Hi all. Hi, Dr. Khalil. Nice to meet you guys.
Oh, nice.
I guess I'm just here to listen and learn from you all, but I might have some questions that I guess if it's possible to ask towards the end. But I'm more here just to sort of listen in.
Great, great. Thank you. Do you come from a religious or theistic background or
Yeah,
anything?
Yeah, I come from a 12 Shia background, and I'm from Australia, by the way. And so it's just really interesting because when I did first stumble upon your content, Dr. Khalil, it was mind blowing. First listening to, I think it was a symposium with you and Dr. Shabir Ali, where you talk about the crucifixion of Christ, and that to me, that's where it first started. Where being on this constant study and research, and yeah, it's really led me to lots of interesting conversations that I've had over the years now. So it's just something that I'm really fascinated by. So yeah, I've 12 Shia background, but I guess with regards to the crucifixion of Christ, I guess I'd be in the Ismaili camp because I'm convinced that according to based on Todd Lawson's work, it is not a denial or affirmation. It's quite a neutral verse in Surah 4:157. So I'm kind of convinced with this Ismaili perspective on it. So I guess that's kind of my background.
All right, very cool. Thank you for sharing that, and in a bit, we'll invite you to speak more about that. And we have a the Brethren of Purity is here. So although it's one person managing the account, the Brethren of Purity is actually a fairly recent coalition that formed in the months leading up to my debate with a certain metaphysician. And the Brethren of Purity is basically a alliance, a cooperation of Muslims who all come from different denominations, but all share a love for both philosophy and mysticism. So the Brethren of Purity includes Ismailis, 12 Shia, Sufis of different traditions, Ishraqis, and so Avicennians. Welcome, Brethren of Purity. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum. Well, as Khalil described, I'm just using the account right now. I am 12 Shia, so I'm Elias, right? But yeah, the Brethren of Purity itself, we have been working on this and having talks and stuff, and we have all the people, like from different philosophical backgrounds, Ismailis, Akbarians, Avicennians. So yeah, I just hopped in to see what's happening here.
All right. And Luke, welcome.
Hey, how you doing? I hope you're doing good. Hope everyone in the chat is doing good. I'm a Christian apologist. I reside in the States, and I consider myself a student of the Word, always learning. So I had some questions on the crucifixion I wanted to ask you afterwards. And real quick, Dark Templar. As I tuned in on StreamYard, there was a little lag, but I caught you mentioning Todd Lawson and mentioning the crucifixion as well. So I just want to make sure I'm not going to ask maybe the same question you might ask, or can you reiterate briefly what you were talking about before I came in, please?
So Dark Templar, at least he's disappeared from the stream for now. But I can say what he said. So so many people are aware that the Quran, seems to deny that Jesus was crucified, right? And the majority Muslim understanding that came to develop over history is that the Quran outright denies the crucifixion of Jesus. However, that understanding that it outright denies crucifixion is not unanimous in Islam and in Islamic exegesis.
Is that your position?
Yeah, so the position of the Shia Ismaili Muslims, a community which I'm a member of, our position, as well as the position of some Sufis. So there's even a Sufi commentary on the verse that is traced back to Imam Jafar Sadiq. So some Sufis, the Ismailis, and there are even now some more sort of modernist Muslim exegetes. So there's a minority of Muslims who actually believe the Quran does not deny the crucifixion itself. The Quran, what the Quran is actually denying, is a claim made by certain Jewish groups to have killed and crucified Jesus as a way to, invalidate his claims to be the Messiah.
Right.
So
Right.
the way I read the verse in my tradition, but I would make the argument from a purely sort of academic perspective. And so some academics have made the argument, without any sectarian backing, that the Quran is only denying a Jewish claim found in the Talmud that they crucified Jesus, and in fact, it does not deny the crucifixion as a fact. And of course, there are two other verses in the Quran where it is said that God caused Jesus to die.
Okay.
So that's sort of the perspective that I take. And that's what, before he left, Dark Templar was talking about.
Was he for that position, or was he going to ask you about that as well?
He was for, so he said that he agreed with this reading that I hold to. Because although academics have known about this reading, I sort of brought it to YouTube in a sense many years ago. I think almost 10 years ago, and that's when a lot of people first heard of it. And now, there's more academics. So, for example, I know Shabir Ali is open to this reading.
Right, he's open to that reading, and I'm aware that I think Ali Atay is, as well as
exactly
other numerous.
Ali Atay is open to that reading, although it's hard, it's tough to gauge where Ali Atay stands on this. It's not clear to me because I hear different things. But yeah, that's basically, so Mr. Templar on here, he agreed with this reading.
Okay. Okay. I do agree with many even Sunni Muslims who come to the conclusion based on exegesis that according to the exegesis, it's not a denial of the crucifixion, as you were saying, that they believe it's a denial specifically to the Jews contextually as they're being indicted in the verses previously. And they deny, that's the denial that they say. So I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the denial that the Quran rejects the notion that Jesus was crucified is more of an Islamic tradition that kind of developed. But now more and more you start hearing Sunni Muslims come to accept the reality, or they come to a position that the Quran does give a clear denial that the ones who didn't kill or crucify Jesus, for sure, according to the Quran, would be the Jews. Recently, a Muslim by the name of Kenny Boomer, he was having a discussion with a Christian, and I was surprised to hear him. At first, he started off saying it was just a complete denial, and then through the course of the discussion, he ended up concluding that, well, the Quran is specifically denying the Jews. And then he says, well, but it's possible that it could be denying all other groups as well. And then some other Muslims made it. So I read some of Ali's work, and I listened to one of his streams, and he had an academic approach. He gave 4 interpretations, and 3 of the 4 were exegetical. And so I do like what he said. It seemed very consistent with the other 2 verses that you had in mind. And one of the questions I would ask you, Doctor, is given your view that the Quran doesn't deny that Jesus was crucified, only that that he was crucified but didn't die as a result of the crucifixion. What is the probability, in light of the historical evidence, that you think or that you hold to, that a person who is crucified and experienced a full Roman crucifixion, what is the percentage you think that they had a chance of surviving?
That's a good question. The if there was, like, the little I know about this, because I don't specialize in this period of history, and I definitely don't specialize in Roman history, but everything I've read on the topic, which is not much, tells me that a person cannot really survive the crucifixion, at least as it's, as historians agree what happened to Jesus. It doesn't seem to me that it's survivable. So, but again, like, how long was Jesus on the cross, and what was the actual bodily impact of that crucifixion? I don't know the specifics of that, so I can't really give you any answer based on my own knowledge. All I know is that the historians who study the historical Jesus, I don't know any of them think that someone could survive that. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is my view, but it's also the view of the Ismaili tradition. So I looked this up. Every Ismaili exegete in classical, uh, in the classical period, every Ismaili Muslim exegete had the same view of this verse. They all affirmed the historical crucifixion and that Jesus died on the cross. So this is my position as well.
Right. Okay.
Sorry.
So just to tack onto that, yeah, I read some of Tall Austin's work as well as John O'Brien's, and I can't recall any of the names of the Ismailis that do record that, but yes, I do know that they have always recorded that. That's been their position, and I do find it consistent with both exegesis and with the historical evidence. Would you agree then? And to be fair, I know that you said that you haven't really studied it in depth and in this particular time period in this history, but would you agree that the chances of someone surviving a full Roman crucifixion is highly improbable?
The thing is, I don't know what what the typical crucifixion entailed in the first century, because I have not studied that. All I
Okay.
can tell you is that I'm not aware, based on the Jesus historians that I've read, I'm not aware of a historical scholar who thinks Jesus could have survived. And
Okay.
that's all I
Fair
can
enough.
say. But if we spoke to like a Roman historian, maybe somebody could tell us more. I recall reading once, and again, this is just a recall, I can't cite it, that they it may be that like he wasn't actually nailed to the cross, he was like tied to the cross. But this is just a recall. That's probably, I don't know where
Right.
I read this. But
Right.
otherwise, like, it's just not my area. I couldn't really tell you.
No, fair enough. I appreciate the honesty, doctor. If anything, I could send you some sources. John Granger Cook, he's a scholar. He specializes in the crucifixion. Actually, he has one of the most exhaustive works on the crucifixion. I believe it's called Crucifixion in the Mediterranean. It's about 600 pages. It's a very exhaustive work. He cites all sources from antiquity, but he as well as others do, as David I want to say David Chapman. David Chapman is another scholar who specializes in the crucifixion, and they also cite historical sources, but they would say a typical Roman crucifixion was inclusive of the flogging, and many of the times the flogging was so severe that the crucifixion victim didn't survive. Now, of course, you can't take my word, but I'd be more than happy to afterwards,
Yeah, I
to
mean,
send
to
you
be
some of the
honest,
sources.
you don't really need to convince me. Like, I'm not a swoon theorist, right? Like, I don't hold the view that he just fainted or something. I see no reason to deny that Jesus died physically on the cross. mean, that's
Mm.
to
Right.
me, that's what happened. I think the Quran is perfectly in line with that because I don't think the Quran is interested in denying a historical event. I think what the Quran does, and this is something that many people I think misunderstand, I think the Quran does narrative theology. So it's much more interested in theological framings of these things,
Right.
and that's what it's doing here. Because there was, and there's some research that has shown this, that we know in the Talmud, which is talks about the death of Jesus, and it historically claims that the Jewish rabbis tried Jesus,
Right.
sentenced him to dying, stoned him, and then hung him. Right, like that's what the Talmud claims. Um, we know that didn't happen, right? Obviously,
Right.
it's not part of history, but that is a theological claim in a sense. It's a theological polemic in the Talmud, right? And it's designed to sort of invalidate any chance that this could be the Messiah. So
Exactly.
and the Talmud, is being compiled, coming together like just before the Quran is being revealed. So it's part of the milieu. It's part of the context. You would expect the Quran to be in dialogue with these late antique, post-biblical works, right? Which it is. Like we know the Quran is aware of the Talmud and other material. So I think that's the first context. The Quran is responding to Talmudic polemic and it's refuting it. And the second context, and I don't recall the specifics, but the author Juan Cole, he's a professor at University of Michigan, he published a paper about this as well. And let me see if I can find the name of it very quickly. But he mentioned some reports of how I think it was, let me see here, certain I think it was the Sasanians who would mock the idea of Jesus. He wrote this in an article. Basically, there was some mock the Sasanian Empire would mock the fact that Jesus died a cruel death, right?
Right.
So according to Juan Cole, this is another context for what the Quran is doing. That it's actually responding to Sasanian. Okay, here I found it. So he blogs about this. So there's a peer-reviewed article, and the summary is on his website. I can even post it in the chat. So Juan Cole believes that, I'll quote him. I can just show this on the screen because I have that power now. So let me just do that. So this would be like the second context for what the Quran is responding to. One is the Talmudic context. So this is a second context that most scholars were not aware of. So Juan Cole has published this in an article, and here's like his little summary. So the key thing is over here. The 7th century Christian sources, for what it's worth, maintain that the large Jewish community in Galilee and Tiberias swung behind the invading Iranians since they had felt mistreated by the Christian Roman Empire. This is the Sasanian Roman War, right? Byzantine War. And then he goes on to say that there was some propaganda from Khusro II against Christianity, against Mary and Jesus. And this is reported by a Christian source that tells us this, right? So according to Juan Cole, with this Sasanian propaganda against Mary and Jesus, which is sort of in line with certain Jews at that time, the Quran is refuting that propaganda. So he's saying in 157, the Quran is denying that the Jews killed Jesus and is doing so as a part of a strategy in the Medina period of denying Sasanian propaganda talking points. So that's a second context.
I think those are more consistent with the context that we have in Surah 4 157. I do know a couple of Muslim apologists that have used the Talmud as a response that the Quran is responding to what the Talmud is claiming. Therefore, they say, well, it's in line with history. And I do think that that is more consistent. And I'm not sure if it's Simon Gathercole. If he's the one, his name is coming to my mind, but Simon Gathercole, he may have been one, but similarly to the article you have on the screen, he mentions that there could be a possible claim. He's responding to a Muslim statement and a possible, you use the word propaganda. I can't recall the word he used, but similar to propaganda, that it's a response to that. And so I'm unaware of the article that you mentioned, but I do think that that's possible, definitely possible. Would you? Here's my last question to you, Doctor, because I know there's other panelists on. Do you consider the Gospels as historical sources, and do you appeal to them in some way or another in substantiation of your position that Jesus wasn't crucified, but rather he was crucified, just didn't die as a result of it?
Yeah, I do. I look at the Gospels similar to how critical scholars of the New Testament and historical Jesus look at the Gospels. I believe we do have historical truth in the Gospels. Of course, I believe if you're reading the Gospels for history, you would have to apply historical methods to them, right?
Of course.
Just like you would apply it to any other source. But I do believe that the Gospels have historical data and that they can be analyzed to make historical claims. And they are, they are the primary sources we have to know who the historical Jesus was and some of what he taught and so on. And I
Right.
I fully am in support of, the historical Jesus scholarship and that sort of thing. In fact, my colleague at my college, this is what he does, for a living, like historical Jesus stuff. So yeah, and I would appeal. I think history is important, right? So for me, when
Definitely.
you have something that's like well established historically, that has to factor into how we interpret the Quran.
I absolutely agree with you, Doctor. Now, it seems like you do appeal to, specifically, you do grant at least portions of the crucifixion narrative or the passion narrative. And would you say I'm correct? Like, as you grant the Gospels as the primary sources for the sayings and deeds of the historical Jesus, would you also, in relation to the crucifixion, say we can look at the gospel narratives of the crucifixion, and there are things that you personally do see and take into consideration in regard to your position and in regard to Jesus not, or in regard to the Quran not denying that Jesus was crucified?
Yeah, sorry, I my thing froze a bit. I'm. What is the question exactly? Are you just asking me
Yeah, let me
whether?
let me rephrase it.
Yeah,
Let
sure.
me rephrase the question. So you said right now that we need to take into consideration the Gospels, as all scholars do, in regard to the sayings and deeds of the historical Jesus. So I know you do grant that, and that's great. Do you grant specifically the passion narrative in the Gospels? When you look to see what took place, do you also try to harmonize what we see in the passion narrative in respect to your position that Jesus was crucified, just didn't die as a result of it?
No, I think Jesus was crucified and he died.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But do you also, like, in your position that Jesus was crucified, and
Yeah.
you get that from the Quran, and it's that position that he was is also corroborated with historical evidences, do you also consider the passion narrative within the Gospels as sources that you can look to corroborate your position?
But what do we mean by passion narrative? Like the time from like the trial to his death, or is that what
Correct.
you mean? Or
Correct.
all the?
Correct.
Well, I think I haven't done this because I'm not a historian of the historical Jesus, but assuming that some of these historians have analyzed the different passion, because they're not all the same, right? I mean, the narration of the passion narrative differs from through the gospels.
And the synoptics, John's
Yeah, the
gospel.
synoptics and John. I mean, it's not like they all present the exact same thing. So my
Right.
assumption is that, and just you do this with all historical documents when they report something, my assumption is that where the gospel narratives basically converge, the points on which they converge regarding the passion narrative, that this is the historical core of it, and I would affirm whatever that historical core is.
All right. Fair enough. That's great. That's great.
So
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen it. I've written a whole article on this, the crucifixion and Shia Ismaili Islam. In fact, in our tradition, not only do we affirm the crucifixion, but we do this whole symbolic, esoteric esoteric interpretation of the cross as well. Like we try.
I came across it, Doctor, but I didn't ever get the chance to check it out. And then so I saw you live, so I said, hey, maybe I'll have a time to ask you about it. And I am aware of your position, and my reason for asking you if you do accept the passion narrative within the Gospels as support for your position is because I've spoken to two Ismaili Muslims, and they rejected the New Testament documents wholesale, whereas two or three other ones that I did speak to, they did grant portions of the passion narrative. And so I wanted to see your position on that. So yours seems more in line, and as you stated right now, the core of it you would agree with.
Yeah, I mean, again, I approach the New Testament as historical document, right? So when you approach something as a historical document, you believe there's a historical kernel or core in there, and you're not sort of committing to the theologizing that's in the same document, right? So the New Testament, especially the synoptics, as well as Gospel of John and Paul's letters, I mean, they're full of theologizing, right? They're not just narrating things that happen, but they're like offering a theological, soteriological reading. So I believe, and every historian believes, right, that one can separate, one can decouple historical facts from theological interpretation of those facts. So obviously, I can look at the New Testament, I can mine it and affirm the historical kernel and core of what's in there, without agreeing with the theology of the New Testament, which obviously I don't agree with the theology of the New Testament. And I think sometimes what happens is that when you're talking to whether it's Muslims or it could be Jews or whoever, sometimes we're very quick to dismiss something at all because we don't agree with the theology of it.
Right.
In fact, I mean, I know people who grow up, like when I teach my class about Christianity, which I do, right? Some people who grow up Christian, they're not Christian anymore for whatever reason. And they're surprised when I tell them that we would look to the New Testament as our primary historical source, right? Because their thinking is it's like all or nothing.
Right.
Right? But it's not all or nothing. I mean, just like, and I tell them the same thing about the Quran. I was like, look, you don't have to believe that Muhammad is a prophet to use the Quran as the primary historical source for the mission of Muhammad. So I think the ability to read religious texts that are written not primarily for a historical purpose, texts that are written for a theological purpose, but the ability to study religious texts with a historical lens and retrieve historical data is an important skill that I think people of all faiths need to learn.
I think that recognition is very, very important. Like I've said, or like you said, I'm in agreement with. I've spoken to numerous Muslims, and there are always some that, in particular Sunni Muslims that I have in mind that I've spoken to, and they do have this stereotype that they cannot accept anything recorded in the New Testament, not realizing that scholars, textual scholars, historians like Brent Nungri and God's Library and other ones, they do mention that uh, irrespective of your religious background, whether you're religious or not, whether you're a Buddhist, a Muslim, as a Christian, the New Testament in and of itself are treated as historical documents, whether you're religious or not. And so I think to be able to make that distinction is very, very important because it will change how you have interfaith dialogues. Um, it'll open up new doors to allow you to recognize important history that might help you in understanding whether your position or your opponent's position in any type of dialogue. And so I do think it's vitally important to make that distinction. One of the last things I would say is, because I see you have another guest, is I'm gonna send you, after the stream is over, I'm gonna send you some information on the sources I have. I know this is not your expertise or this is your area, doctor, but just in case, if you are curious, you wanted to take a look at some of the sources. I do know you said your colleague is more of the one who specializes in this and the historical Jesus. And my whole reason just for coming on the panel and to ask you about this is because me as a Christian, I do think that your position is a lot more consistent with what the Quran says and with the historical evidence, which is vast, as you know. But I do think what is problematic in my eyes, in my view, in my opinion, is that in light of the historical evidence that we do have that do record how victims were typically crucified, in particular in this time period and Roman crucifixion, I do think the chances of someone surviving a full Roman crucifixion would have been extremely, extremely low. And I even mentioned this question to Dr. Shabir Ali as well, and he concurred that, well, it's probably 1% chance, but this happened to be that 1% chance. It just so happened to be that 1% chance Jesus survived. And so, to me, in my view, is I find your position consistent, but um, I find the conclusion
Sorry, let me
that
just interrupt you there. Just to be clear, I don't think Jesus survived the crucifixion.
I'm sorry, doctor, you broke up. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So I do not believe that Jesus survived the crucifixion.
Okay, your position is that he was crucified and he died.
Yes, that is my position. Just to be very clear, I think I said it earlier too.
Okay, I must have misunderstood you.
Yeah.
Okay, so okay, so it was
for
my
me,
understanding.
He died on the cross. Basically, as the historians affirm, Jesus died on the cross. The Quran is not denying that. The Quran is denying the claim of certain Jewish polemicists who claim to have crucified and killed Jesus. That is what the Quran is denying. And what the Quran is instead doing is it's giving it a different narrative. The narrative being that Jesus died by the will of God, which is why 2 verses in the Quran say that God caused Jesus to die. And I think that's actually quite consistent with how in Acts chapter 2, I think, is it chapter 2? Where it says, fellow Israelites, listen to this. This is Peter preaching. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. So there's this idea already in Acts that Jesus was crucified by his enemies, but this is part of the divine plan. right?
Right.
That's what I see the Quran saying, that fact that Jesus died it's from the divine plan. It's the divine decree that this is to happen, and therefore the enemies of Jesus, cannot claim agency or credit for this.
Right. I've actually I'm familiar with the interpretation, doctor, but I have not spoken to a Muslim representative who actually explicated it, actually verbalized it. I read it in your sources. I have some sources right here which mention that interpretation, and I do agree with you. It's something that pertains to the divine decree, and as you read in Acts, so I would completely agree. I'm just it's my first time speaking to an actual Muslim who says, "Hey, I hold this specific view in it," and so that's great to know. That's great to hear. I apologize. I misunderstood you earlier. Then I didn't
No,
catch that part.
that's no problem. I mean, it's StreamYard, who knows? It sound is probably cutting out. So, listen, my friend, it's been great having you. If it's okay with you, I don't have like a paid StreamYard yet, so if I can sort of move you to the backstage and bring up, there's a couple people who are sort of waiting. In fact, we have Dark Templar back, um, and I think
Yeah, doctor. Of course, of
he
course.
had a comment about this as well.
You know
So
what? I apologize to you and to everyone on the panel right now because I did tell you like I think 30 minutes ago, hey, I got one more question, and then I prolonged it. But I appreciate you having me on. Thank you guys on the panel for your patience. Thank you, doctor. After the stream is over, I'll try to leave it in the comment or a way you can read the information just in case you want to take a look at it or lay it aside. And I appreciate your time to answer the questions. And maybe I'll speak to you another time in the soon future.
yeah, well, it's been great having you. Thanks for coming on. Of course, I enjoyed the discussion a lot.
All right, likewise. You take care, guys. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care, brother. By the way, Dr. Andani, probably gonna have I'm probably gonna have to be heading out. I didn't expect to be like here this long.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm very new to like controlling StreamYard stages, so I need to work on my moderation skills.
Oh no, it's all good. But yeah, before I go, I just want to say thanks again for all that you do. I appreciate your work. And like I said, your debate with he who must not be named, that made that that turned me into an instant fan of you and your scholarship and your knowledge for Ismaili theology. And even though I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian and I believe in monarchical Trinitarianism, like monarchia all the way, that's how I like my theology. Hypothetically, and I believe Dr. Bo Branson said something similar, that if he was a Muslim, Ismaili theology would be the way he would go, and I definitely agree. It definitely sounds more sensible and logical than the Athari creed that says that God has hands.
Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing your views. Maybe when you come back, you can tell us something about the how do we say it? Monarchical?
Yeah, monarchical Trinitarianism, monarchy of the Father, or monarchia.
Yeah, maybe next time.
God willing.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me, Doctor, and take care.
Take care. All right. Who have we not heard from here? So, Ignis, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good morning, Dr. Andani. I'm saying morning because it's almost half past midnight. Anyways, I just wanted to ask if you view the Quran as a literal historical text, as in, whenever the Quran is narrating stories and tales of old prophets and saints like Abraham and Moses and Lot, and whenever it's describing, the details of their life and ministry, do you view these events as literal events that took place within history? Because I'm not sure if you're aware, you probably are, but biblical scholarship has shown that there is no archaeological data to that shows that a literal exodus or a literal flood could have taken place, or that Alexander built a wall in the Caucasus, which is something specific to the Quran in Surah 18. So I just wanted to know what are your views and what's the mainstream Ismaili view on if the Quran is, you know, inerrant in that sense. Because as someone that comes from a, I guess you could say, a quote unquote evangelical Sunni background, you know, we're basically taught that, yeah, the Quran is the absolute truth on all these, and every story that, you know, that's narrated in the Quran actually it happened exactly as it's written, as God, you know, spoke it to Muhammad. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, without going into the details, I think that some of the Quranic stories are based on a real history, but I don't think that the Quran necessarily is, you know, giving us a literal history. I think that the further back the figures go, the less sort of literally historical it is, because the Quran is narrating based on the late antique and Arabian memory of these figures. The Alexander thing is a great example, right? The Alexander epic had, by the time of the Quran, the Alexander story had evolved through Christian and Jewish re-narration. So in these re-narrations of Alexander, from Jewish and Christian communities, Alexander is a monotheist believer in God.
Right.
And what the Quran does is it picks up the latest memory of these figures that the Quranic audience is already aware of and already believes in. And what the Quran does is it re-narrates the historical memory that people have of the figures. The Quran re-narrates it, but it re-theologizes it as well, so as to promote a particular, you know, Quranic theology, if you will. This is what I see the Quran doing. Now, I mean, Jesus is a good example of this, right? So there was a historical Jesus. I mean, you know, everybody, you know, that's the main view. We can historically support there was historical Jesus who made, you know, prophetic messianic claims and so on. So what the Quran says about Jesus, that he spoke as a baby and made birds out of clay, right? That cannot be substantiated by the historical scholarship and the historical materials that we have. I mean, everybody knows this. But why does the Quran have that? Well, it's because the Jesus story from, you know, the first century, over 600 years, the biography of Jesus as re-narrated by Christian communities had evolved. So you do have the Arabic infancy Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus does speak as a baby, and he does make birds out of clay. And I also think in the Proto Evangelium of James, he might also speak as a baby. I have to double check. So the Quran picks up on the latest narrative, which you could look at as an exegesis of the biblical stories. The Quran picks that up, it re-narrates it. But if you compare what Jesus does in the infancy gospel, when he speaks or when he does a miracle, and you compare to the Quranic version, the Quran has embedded a different theology in there, a theology that is in line with the Quranic monotheism. So now in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, Jesus just makes these birds fly, right? He just does it. But in the Quranic story, it adds, you know, I do this by God's permission. Like all the miracles are, the word by God's permission is added. So that's what I see the Quran doing. It's actually teaching a theology, and it's using the well-known, you know, historical memory of these different figures as a device to teach its theology. Now, does that mean there was no historical Jesus? No, obviously there was a historical Jesus. That's why I say that some of the Quranic stories will be based on real historical figures, even if we don't have historical evidence of them. Like, I don't think we have historical evidence of Abraham or Moses, like as figures, or what we have of historical evidence of them is very, very scant, right? Yeah, the Quran talks about Moses, talks about Abraham. So I think, although I can't prove it historically, I think Abraham, Moses, many of these people mention these Quranic characters and biblical characters. I think the circulating stories about them, whether it's in the Bible, whether it's in, there's a ton of post-biblical literature like the Book of Jubilees and all this, the apocalypse of Abraham and the apocalypse of so and so. So these stories evolve through these religious traditions. The Quran picks up the latest evolution of the story, it re-theologizes it, and it tells the story. And that's why the Quranic narrative was so effective to its audience. But I think there are real historical people, at the core of these. But I do not believe that the Quranic stories have to be taken as literal history. In the Ismaili tradition, what tends to be done is that the stories of the prophets are interpreted esoterically. It's not an interpretation that negates the historicity of these people, but often the different episodes that they go through, the Ismaili tradition interprets these episodes esoterically and not literally. So, a good example, the idea that Abraham was commanded by God to slaughter or sacrifice his son, which is mentioned in the Quran, mentioned in the Bible. The Ismaili interpreters, and I've read the text myself, they don't actually believe that Abraham was literally told to kill his son. They say that this sacrifice story is an allegory and it's a symbol for the real truth. And the real truth was that Abraham was a prophet of God and he was also a divinely appointed guide, what we call an imam. And the order to Abraham to sacrifice your son to God is a command for Abraham to appoint his son as the next divine guide or the next imam after him. And of course, the person who takes on that leadership role to be the spiritual guide of humankind, that itself is a spiritual sacrifice. That's a heavy burden for someone to carry. So that's how Ismailis interpreted, just for example, the story of Abraham sacrificing his child. They don't actually, we don't actually believe he was actually ordered to kill his son. So this type of interpretation de-allegorizes some of these stories, and similar things. We have similar interpretations of other narratives.
Right, right. I saw, similar views as what you just said, being expressed by Dr. Javad Hashmi, who identifies as Sunni. But I don't like, if you look back at how the early exegetes and the early audience of the Quran viewed these stories, it doesn't seem like there's a precedent for what you just said. Yeah, like it seems like they view them as literal. Meanwhile, nowadays where people are allegorizing them because of scholarship showing that there's no way there could have been a historical Moses leading millions of Israelites out of Egypt because the archaeological data not substantiating it, just like what you just said.
Well, I think when you talk about the early audience of the Quran, right? Remember, the early audience of the Quran would have known the story in its not in a historical truth form. They would have known the story in its most evolved form, right? And that's what the Quran picks up. Now, did many of the early audience understand it literally? Yes, I think they did. But I think that's part of the point. The literal meaning is a meaning, but in our understanding, that's just step one, basically. Like, you begin with the literal meaning because it's almost like an archetype, and you can get certain, moral lessons from the literal meaning. But in our view, you don't stop there. You start with the literal and you begin like climbing this ladder. So we believe in the Shia tradition, we believe that the prophet and his family did know the inner meaning of the stories, and it's actually their job. The prophet, his family, and their descendants, they carry this inner meaning, and they taught it to the people that they saw worthy of attaining that level of knowledge. But in a sense, what the Quran is doing, right, is it's using what the latest evolution of a prophetic story as raw material to teach a theological message. So the Quran is actually teaching a message that goes much deeper than, you know, this character and this episode. And when later communities interpret the Quranic stories esoterically, the Ismailis do this, the Sufis do this, we're actually not doing something that's foreign to the Quran. We're actually just maintaining the spirit of the Quran. Because what the Quran is doing is it picks up the latest evolution of a story, it retells it, but it gives it a different theological interpretation. The theological interpretation that the Quran is giving to these well-known stories is something new. It's something fresh. It's something that, you know, causes a change in the beliefs and the outlook of its audience. When a later Muslim community does esoteric interpretation on these stories, that is actually another way of sort of theologizing the material in a sense, and to theologize a narrative. The Quran does it, and the later Muslim esoteric communities do that. So I think that's actually quite in line with the spirit of what the Quran is trying to do.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Khalil Andani, for presenting the Ismaili position. If you mind, like, I'll present like a more Sunni position. Like, I'm Ash'ari, right? So I'll be coming from that perspective.
Yeah, of course.
here.
Go ahead. I mean, I'm not, just to be clear, I'm just saying, like, I'm not here to sort of, you know, assert, you know, this
Yeah.
position over.
No,
another.
completely.
This is
I
just a
understand.
low key thing. So you can go ahead. You know, we're not, at least this stream, and we're not here to like argue or debate. So I'm happy to
Yeah.
hear what you have to say. Everyone should hear what you have to say. And if someone else wants to share something else, no problem.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I think, you know, I hope you'll agree with me. I think great theologians in our tradition said, you know, debate is not always the best way to truth. In fact, in most cases, it probably isn't. So a lot of times more can be gained from conversation. But to coming back to the topic of discussion, I think, well, in Sunni position, you know, we generally do understand, obviously, these stories. We do not do batin by default, so to say. So we generally understand these stories as literal, as in they happened at some point. But at the same time, there is sort of an agreement to an extent here with us, is that I think even like everyone agrees on it, you know, I mean, maybe like, exclude some more complete literalists, but most groups agree that the Quran is not a history book. Like, it's not meant to be read for you to, like, as a record of what happened, right? Instead, history is like, these stories are presented to teach a lesson. So you shouldn't, like, one shouldn't expect a nitpick of every detail, like why doesn't Quran, for example, talk about the size or like the exact proportions of Noah's Ark? Because that's not relevant to its story, right? It's not what it's focusing to convey. Obviously, that's contrasts with some parts of the Old Testament. But the Quran in this case is more concerned with the message and the teaching. Now, the difference obviously here is that we obviously do see that at the same time, it does convey the real truth of what happened. But it shouldn't be read from that historical kind of perspective, but more as a, you know, this kind of intellectual work that is teaching you a lesson about yourself, about the world around you, and so forth. Dr. Khalil Andani, I think, went away. So does anyone else have any, I don't know, topics?
Yeah, I'd love to ask a question if that's all right.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the Quran often addresses the gospel in a singular, and I was wondering if the doctor would have any opinions on whether there was of the four gospels, whether he prefers a singular one or takes the opinion of the of Dr. Ali Ati, I think.
Altai.
Altai
Yeah.
of the Disa Tesseron. Yeah, just generally interested.
Yeah, I mean, I can say my position while he's awake is I think he said he's going to be away for some minutes, but I think I think in general agreement, and I don't think it's completely averse, is that there are different opinions, all right, in like Sunni tradition on this, but some said it was like a literal text that was revealed, like it was like a sent down from heaven to Jesus, peace be upon him, right? But most agrees that it probably wasn't in a textual format, but rather it was sayings of Jesus. So, I mean, if you want to like compare to church history, right? I think in early church history, for many of the Christians, the gospel was explicitly the words of Jesus. So they'd like go around in these gospels and highlight the words of Jesus, right? And everything else would be more contextual. So I think that's kind of similar to how a lot of Muslims understand it.
So would that be, I guess, in a way similar to like what the hypothetical Q document would be?
I'm not sure about that. I think Q is more like recording what Jesus said in stories and so forth. I think a lot of sayings of Jesus, like just quotes from him, would be kind of a gospel, depending on the context in which they were uttered, right? But I'm not sure. Like, I think Q is like a distilled form of that, or like sort of processed form of that, if you get me, right? Like put into text. Because all revelation is initially oral, like Quran as well was initially orally revealed to the prophet, right? So that's how we understand each revelation. It's just that in the case of Jesus, peace be upon him, you obviously didn't have it put into the final format of a book, but instead you had snippets here and there which were later incorporated. That's how we understand it, at least.
So of the four current gospels, which would you say is the most Islamic? I know that's kind of like pushing towards like a definitive format that may or may not actually have an Islamic answer. But if you had to be cornered,
if I had to choose, and don't take it as a hard choice.
I will not take it as let me put it this way: I won't take your choice as gospel.
Yeah, that's a good Christian similitude there.
I'm back, so I can take you off the hook if you want.
But I would say Mark. That's my opinion.
Mark. Okay,
that's my opinion.
Hi, Doctor. I asked I know the Quran speaks of the gospel. I didn't know if you had of the four. I didn't know if you had an opinion of what would be the most Islamic of the four gospels.
Are you asking what gospel is most in line with Islamic views, or are you asking what I think the singular gospel the Quran mentions actually is?
I would be more interested in the former, but if you wanted to answer both, I'd be open to that.
Yeah, so my view, I actually have a whole video on blogging theology about this.
With Paul Williams.
Yeah, so that's where I gave my view of what the Quranic concept of gospel is. So that's all in there. And my view, from both a Quranic analysis and I looked in the Gospels themselves, is that the singular Injil in the Quran refers to the actual words that Jesus spoke, like the preaching of Jesus, not the preaching about Jesus, but the preaching of Jesus. that is what the Quran means by the singular term gospel.
So I asked the I guess the moderator if that would mean maybe something closer to the Q source, or just
Well, the Q source would just be a hypothetical historical document, right?
that is the correct answer.
Yeah. So, but when the Quran talks about the singular gospel that Jesus preaches, the
Mhm.
Quran is not talking about a textual corpus.
If
It's
it,
not talking about a physical book.
mhm. If
It's
I had to,
talking about a message from
Mhm.
God.
mhm. if I had
So,
to if I had to corner you, which of the four do you think best represents
well,
your at least your view, if not
I mean,
the general Islamic view?
I think so. Remember, the four that you have in your New Testament, none of those is what the Quran calls the gospel.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's right.
Rather, the four that you have are the memories that I guess disciples of the disciples have of Jesus that was transmitted. So those four gospels that you have are the story about Jesus, right? And of course, they do contain uh, something of what Jesus actually spoke, right? But what the Quran calls the gospel is what Jesus himself spoke, not what other people in 2-3 generations later wrote about him.
Mhm.
So
So
there's a
you would take
difference
a
there.
more historical, critical approach towards at least the four gospels.
Yeah,
On that. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah,
On that
so
like you
I
could.
would just note that the four gospels themselves refer to Jesus going around Galilee and the villages preaching a message. And the message that Jesus preached to people is also called gospel singular,
Mhm.
right? So even the
Mm.
four biographical gospels refer to Jesus preaching a single gospel.
Mhm. Mark,
Right?
like for example, Mark 1:14 and 15.
1:14, Mark 13:10. In fact, I had it on a slide. I can even show it to you.
If I remember correctly, even the I think 2nd century, like earliest some of the like church fathers, refer to like our Lord's gospel. They wouldn't say like gospel according to Mark or gospel according. They would say our Lord's gospel.
That's correct. Yeah.
Correct.
So I don't know if you can see this. This is just from my slide on that show, Blogging Theology. And I tried to show that you have the term gospel, even in Greek, right? Even in the New Testament.
Evangelion.
Yeah, it's multivalent. So there's like different layers of gospel. So the primarily actually what Jesus said, like what Jesus told to people, is the gospel, right? And Jesus said that he gets it all from God. Like Jesus said,
This is a straw man argument. It's irrelevant if you reject if Jesus is God or not. So I do have a categorical syllogism that I could present.
Hold on, bro. My friend, Mr. Ultimate Judeo-Christian. I know who you are. You can say your piece, but we're just finishing this discussion. So I'm just trying to answer the question: what do I think the Quran means by the term gospel, which it uses singular? This is what I think the Quran is talking about. It's talking about the words of Jesus, right? And that is distinct. That's conceptually distinct from the preaching about Jesus, which you find from Paul and other, New Testament writings, right? So whether Jesus preaching, i.e., what came from his mouth, whether this was written down on paper or not, is irrelevant to its revelatory status. at least from a Quranic perspective. Contrary to popular belief, the Quran does not make something physically written on pages preach.
Hang on, you've just contradicted yourself. I'm not trying to be condescending, but the
How have I
first sentence,
contradicted myself?
because the first sentence of the Quran is self-contradictory, as there's no mention of a creation point, so it doesn't complement God's ultimate truthful lovingness.
Okay, so
as
this
even
is again not this, my friend, is not on topic. We're
It's not
not
relevant.
talking about.
it is on topic. You're talking about the Quran, and I'm just debunked the Quran.
Oh my
So it
goodness,
is
you
on
just
topic.
debunked the Quran. Really?
Wow.
I must have
Yes.
missed
I
the
think this.
news flash.
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, as Ibn Sina would say, give me a definition of love that is devoid of your emotions. So, or like
Love
goodness in
is
you.
the expression of giving. So God gave us revelation
Okay.
and the
Listen, my
universe as
friend,
an
Mr.
environment.
Mr. Ultimate Judeo-Christian, listen, bro. You've interrupted us like 3 times now. Okay.
Hang on.
We're having
It's
a different
justified.
discussion. There will be a time to talk about your syllogisms. Okay, but now
You
is
just
not
made
that.
a contradiction.
No, I have not made a contradiction.
You have.
No.
I
Well,
hope this is
I just debunked the.
Okay. So
Nice.
I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to get back on this. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
yeah. So this is my reading of. If you just put the Quran aside, the term gospel in the Greek is multivalent, even in the New Testament. So we can talk about different layers. And of course, if we're to give credit to the Christian understanding, right? From a Christian perspective, you would say, yeah, Jesus preached his gospel, right? And then that has been faithfully transmitted, which I've tried to depict on the slide here.
Yeah.
Right? So from a Christian perspective, there is actually a single, in fact, I think, oh man, there's an ad, but you're right that Christian church fathers speak of a single gospel. They do. Right?
Or you could even say like the gospels themselves, because it's the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to John, etc.
Exactly. So I came up with this schema. I don't know if you would agree, but you have like the gospel of Christ, which is what he taught, right? And then there's what Paul calls my gospel, which he also calls the gospel of Christ, but it's really a gospel about Christ, right? About what Jesus did, death, resurrection, dying for sins, and so on. Then you have the four canonical gospels, right, which are the biography of Jesus. And then overall, like the Christian message is called the gospel, you know. And there's this sort of idea that each level is like the witness to the one above. So Jesus is a witness to the Father, and from a Christian perspective, right, the apostles and their disciples are the witness of Jesus, and it goes on. So the church would say that, look, whatever you consider to be the church, like that, the church would be the witness of Jesus, and therefore the guarantor, you know, of his gospel, you know, being faithful. And I think, as you guys said, and I mentioned this, there was an idea in the early church that the gospel in its essence is singular, right? They do use the singular, as you can see here. So I think this idea, which is a Christian idea, that there's really in essence one gospel that comes from God the Father, which the Son proclaimed and which was witnessed. I think the Quran is aware of this idea, and it's sort of engaging with that as well, but obviously with a different theological framing.
I mean, to be honest, I think even let's say an opponent who disbelieves in Quran's divine origin would have to concede that Quran is certainly aware of multiplicity in Christian tradition, because it seems to incorporate or cite or being influenced or by a lot of the different Christian material. So, I mean, not just like the canonical Gospels, but a lot of the later ones as well, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
If one approaches it from that perspective, at least, obviously Muslims understand Quran differently.
Thank you, Doctor. I really appreciate it.
Here's an off-topic question, Doctor. I always wondered this, but unlike other academics, I see you a lot more engaging in online sphere, like debate, social media, so forth. Is it something? And I don't know. Do you find time for this? I know a lot of academics are like say like they do some other stuff, or they're not very willing to come on this. And I find it a pity, to be honest, because it's you have all like a lot of people study this for years, and then they have to condense all of that to these papers they release once in a couple of years. So it's commendable what you do.
Well, thank you. That's kind of you to say. It is true. I try. I've always wanted to be a publicly accessible person. And that means going on different platforms and talking about this stuff, and for in a way that's not full of jargon. Now, as for the debates, I mean, it's not something I was ever planning to do. The debate that I had with Mr. Brancatella sort of just happened. I was, in a sense, pressured into doing it. It's not something I really saw myself doing. But I have noticed that even without this debate happening, since I graduated, since I got my PhD, and since I joined Twitter, which was in 2019 or 2018, I have noticed, because I am of a minority Muslim community, I'm Shia Ismaili, I'm vocal, there has been a backlash, mostly from Salafi circles online, against me having a voice. Because I didn't initially engage any of these people, right? And then all of a sudden I'd get takfired or something. They would just randomly.
Well, let me say my opinion on this, because as a Sunni, right, I'm sorry, but I also have to takfir you, but I don't do this. It's not my judgment. I'm following judgment of scholars. That's what we do, right? It's called taqlid. But it's not something personal. And I think you still should be able to speak, like different groups of people, even people who were considered disbelievers in our standards, we're always allowed to speak in our history. So what the kind of silencing is kind of sad,
But here's the thing, right? When you say you're a Sunni, you have to kafir me. I don't think that's true, because if you look at what Ismailis are doing in Muslim majority countries, we fully engage with Sunni communities and Sunni leadership, and they're not takfiring us.
I can understand that, but
Where is this coming from? I'm talking about the real world, right? I'm not talking about the world of the internet and online fatwas, or just getting a legal opinion from Ghazali. I agree that in the medieval era, there was all this takfir of Ismailis. That happened. I mean, we died because of it. But in the world today, you have Muslims. I mean, look at where most Muslims are, right? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, East Africa, right? All these places, and of course in the Arab world too. In most of these places, we have Ismaili communities, and we have Ismaili institutional work being done, okay, on the ground. So our community institutions are building houses that Sunnis and others benefit from. We're building schools, right? We're doing all this.
I recognize the efforts, and
but the thing is, we are not treated as kafirs by the Sunni communities that we engage in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, UAE, Tanzania, and these places. We are welcomed as fellow Muslims. And even in many Western countries, when we hold outreach events, like we hold a special type of event for the Prophet's birthday. Like we've been doing this for like at least 2 decades, maybe 3 decades in Canada, USA, the UK. We send an invite to all the local Muslim communities, Sunni, Twelver. They all come, They don't say we decline you guys, that we have to takfir you. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think
So
it's
I find it
Mhm.
like very like
Mhm.
I don't know what the word is, but when you say that, oh, I have to takfir you, as if it's like a unanimous opinion that Ismailis are Kafirs, we're not Muslims. This is just not the reality on the ground. I don't know why, if this is the unanimous opinion of Ahl Sunnah, why did the Sunni community in East Africa approached us. They came to the Aga Khan and they said, we want you to create a modern madrasa system for Muslim children. Why would you go to a kafir?
Mhm. I think the problem here lies is that we are talking about the actions of certain community sections and laymen, right? Now, the discussion in the theological grounds is different. I mean, if you would agree that laymen do not reflect the scholarly tradition, right? And even in terms of, not just in terms of theology, which layman theology, beyond the general understanding of things, can be wrong. I mean, if you ask laymen, like, all of these questions about like theology, they'll get confused, or they may even give you heretical answers. But even in jurisprudential issues, right? They do not know certain things, and that's normal in traditional Islamic sort of system. They would constantly interact with scholars. Now, that certain communities are welcoming toward Ismailis, I mean, it depends what kinds of welcoming. I think coexistence is possible. Right? Right. I don't think, I mean, there are different opinions on groups that are out of Islam, but I personally don't think, they're to be excluded, or, not allowed to live, or like, in that way, sort of
No, but if
destroyed.
I invited you to
Hmm.
join me for a Milad an-Nabi celebration,
Yeah.
and you consider to me a kafir, you can't come then.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct.
Yeah,
That's
but
not.
the opposite happens. They all come, and these are not just laymen; these are community leaders.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Like,
wrong then.
like
Even
why did
community
the
leaders.
ulama of Pakistan they had 1976? They held a famous conference on Prophet Muhammad, known as the Sirat Conference. All the major ulama of Pakistan attended. You can look this up. It was organized by a major alim of Pakistan too.
Yeah.
Pakistan in the 70s is a very Sunni country. It's not some liberal place, right?
Yeah.
So this is the same Pakistan, which I disagree with, by the way, but they're the ones who, in the 70s, they declared the Ahmadiyyas out of Islam, right? So we're not talking about like this very, liberal place.
Yeah.
In 1976, they hold this conference on the biography of the Prophet. All the ulama attend. Who gives the keynote speech? The Aga Khan, the Imam of the Ismailis. Do you think that if all these people, all this Sunni ulama, universally considered Ismailis as non-Muslim, they would have attended this event? No, they would have all boycotted it. But that's not what happened. So
I
I'm
I
telling you
person.
that you can refer to jurisprudential discussions, but how Muslims regard each other in everyday life on the ground in very significant activities, this is actually the real Islam,
I mean,
not these abstract discussions.
I get what you mean, Professor Ndani, but I just don't agree with it. I mean, for me, obviously, for Sunni understanding, is that the reality on the ground is this kind of practiced or lived Islam, and that's a big thing. Obviously, I mean, even for some of our schools, it was, again, it depends on time, but these days, from Sunni understanding, the closer we were to the time of the Prophet, right, the more that practice reflected the behavior and the attitudes of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Now, these days, we are in the time of the Khalaf, right? We are in the time of, we moved away from centuries upon centuries from the Prophet. Now, we do not judge, we do not extrapolate things from the communal practice as was done in the past, because this practice is fundamentally distanced from the practice of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So I don't think it makes much sense to refer to communal practice in cases referring to theological relationships. Now, obviously, like urf, cultural things play part in fiqh, but so I think, I think we must agree to coexist, and disagree with each other. For us, it's a purely matter of affirming what is true and what's not. I mean, I personally think that someone who does not think that Ismailis are non-Muslim, and he's not actually ignorant about Ismaili beliefs. I think it's something that can take you out of Ahl Sunnah, depending on how severe it goes. These issues are relating to the fundamental pillars of our practice. Like, we do not recognize the form of salah you offer as salah, right? We do not recognize the traveling to Aga Khan as Hajj. For us, it's a denying of what is known by necessity from religion. So this is something that is not just for us to deny. It's not just dangerous, like for you, it's dangerous for us. If someone compromises his beliefs and says Ismailis are Muslim, then he's risking hellfire from Sunni theology. I hope you understand that is a grave offense.
How is okay? So a couple of things. Firstly, when I talk about the reality on the ground, I'm not saying that the reality on the ground is more important than the fiqh or the theology. I'm saying that the reality on the ground reflects the actual theological understanding that these people have.
Okay.
Right? So when the Sunni ulama of Pakistan, most of whom accept Ismaili as Muslims and treat us as Muslims, they do that because they've reached the conclusion that we are. Same for the Sunni community leaders in East Africa. Like, I've met some of these people myself, right?
Yeah.
Or the Sunni community leader, wherever it is. The Sunni community leaders who attend Ismaili Ummah outreach events, which we do often, they attend as Muslims at our invitation. I'm saying they do this because they do consider us as Muslims, because they've reached a theological and legal understanding where we are Muslims.
Yeah, I have to say,
I'm challenging not your view. You have your view. What I'm saying is there is actually no Sunni consensus today. There's no unanimous consensus that we are not Muslims and that you have to takfir us. That's
so. Yeah, I get what you mean to say. That some people said otherwise, so does not mean it's an ikhtilaf issue. I hope you understand that. So some people can say a lot of things. In our history, I mean, I'll give you an example. Zahiri madhab.
Yeah.
So Ibn Hazm, for example, was in a lot of cases because he was a literalist, he was very lenient. Like, for example, he said, you can see your wife even naked before marriage. Or he said masturbation is makruh. He said a lot of other things, to be honest. But because we do not recognize them, we do not recognize their opinions as valid. So just because big people, like Ibn Hazm is not a random person of the street, he's a scholar, he's an intellectual. So that doesn't mean that we as Sunnis are obliged to recognize it as a valid opinion. That's where we are coming from.
Who speaks for you Sunnis then? Because again, I can show you Sunnis who, as a matter of theory and practice, consider us Muslims. So your answer seems to be, well, sorry, there's an echo. Your answer to me seems to be that any example I bring of Sunnis holding a contrary view, you're just saying, well, though any like that's just not legitimate because it just doesn't agree with the view you're saying. So isn't there this greater
It's-
problem of
Mhm.
who's the real Sunni now?
So who's the real Sunni is the one who follows Usul ad-Din. So Usul ad-Din is a set of principles in, let's say, Tahawi, even in earlier books. The set of principles all Sunnis agree on. Now, Salafis, for example, deny some of Usul ad-Din. Like they say, for example, God is in a direction, right? In Tahawi, one of the parts of Usul ad-Din is that God is not in any of the 6 directions. So they're depending on what kind of Salafi it is, and most of them probably are not Sunni.
When you say usul, you mean the theological stuff, right? Not ritual.
It's like I wouldn't, yeah, I mean theological, but like the very basics, like something any layman can read and understand, believe in. And if you see that something contradicts it, and you must deny it, it's it's not a matter of discussion for us, and and for each of those statements that you find, it's mass transmitted to us, especially especially in my Aqidah and other Aqidas, we have strict criteria for what is part of Aqaid. So for us, I think the question goes back to Hadith, goes back to the inherited practice of early community. It's not, we do not depart from it. And one can argue, Muslims do it differently today, but for by the way, I saw your sort of like a diagram today in in a talk you're going to do. I'd really appreciate you separated Hanbalis and Karamiya, Mujassim, or how you want to call them, because for us it's these are different groups.
I think I listed Hanbalis, Salafis, Wahhabis as different boxes.
Okay. I just
Oh, you're talking about a different diagram. Just to be clear, the one you're talking about today, right?
Yeah, I saw it.
That does not include Salafi theology.
Okay.
I don't teach Salafi theology. I teach the Hanbali Athari position as the standard view.
Yeah, that's good.
Not the Ithbat position. Right.
I want to thank you very much, and there are very few people too that knows the difference, and so
yeah, no, I don't teach the Salaf. When I talk about Salafis, which I don't even do in the class, but in my other class, we spend a separate day of talking about the Wahhabi movement and how it's this, it's a bunch of innovation, that started
Absolutely.
in the 1700s. We contextualize it. So when we talk about Hanbalis, we talk about Hanbalis. We don't bring in the Salafi reading of Hanbalism. That's a different class,
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very grateful for that because, for modern Hanbalis, and there are a few left today, there are not many. The position of the early community, for most Muslims, because most Muslims, barring some exceptions, like, for example, in Sunni tradition, there is a hadith of Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, doing a tawil of kursi and saying it means God's knowledge, right? So it's
I've seen it mentioned in the Tafasir, I believe.
Yeah, and it's authentic actually. So there's even Salafis try to reconnect, but our scholars have responded. But most companions obviously followed what's called today Hanbali position. Generally, they didn't Hanbali is kind of a little bit more developed. They'd say no to Tawil and Quran, and most companions just never encountered this kind of stuff. But the way it worked is that they would say, you hear these things about God, you accept it, and you do not think about it. You accept it as true, and you pass it on. And even, I know a lot of Western scholarship disagrees on this, but I can understand why, because, for example, on, let's say, Imam Ahmad's position, right? And we have our reasons to deny what people have to remember is that Imam Ahmad had and you may not know this, but the modern Hanbali ulama talk about this, is that he had like two classes, right? So he had the fiqh class and he had a hadith class. And his fiqh class is actually where he would talk about interpretation. Hadith class is all about like, how do you know something is authentic, chain of transmission, all of the hadith science stuff, right? Now the fiqh class was more interpretation and like, how do you extract a ruling from this hadith and so forth. So the problem is that Imam Ahmad obviously feared for his knowledge, and he wanted to spread the knowledge of hadith as far as he can because he gathered a lot of it, right? So his hadith class was a lot more lenient. He would have like dozens of students, like a lot of students, and he wouldn't be very like inquisitive with them because the point was for them just to learn the hadith and to know what's authentic and what's not authentic, right? And there are narrations of him like getting angry, like anytime anyone asked any question, whenever he would relate a hadith regarding like stuff like, agida, like a hand or something like that. And someone asked like, how does this go use? Like get angry, he would not answer it. But his students from this group, from those who only attended the hadith class and did not attend his fiqh class, they all came out like this mujassima type of agida. And
would you agree then, because this has been documented, that it seems like a lot of the students and students of Ahmed are anthropomorphists?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is something modern proper Hanbali ulama recognize. So the reason for this is what I'm like describing, is because he had two classes.
This is what I saw myself, right?
Oh yeah.
And it's
this is correct. I'll give another example. Like look at this Dawood al-Zahiri, right? He's Zahiri, like he rejects Qiyas, and he's the founder of Zahiri Madhab. And he claims that Imam Ahmad is also Zahiri. He was also a student of him, like he was his direct student. So people attributed all kinds of stuff to him. Especially, these were mostly people just who took the hadith class only, right?
I mean, even Ibn Jawzi complained about his fellow Hanbalis and said,
oh yeah, absolutely.
You guys are completely misunderstanding.
But the methodology itself, like the Mujassima methodology itself, does not go back to Imam, like this incident of Imam Ahmad's students. It mostly goes back to Muqatil bin Sulaiman, if you know him. And he was a teacher of Muhammad ibn Karam.
Sorry, who did you say?
Muqatil ibn Sulaiman.
Okay, yeah, I mean the Mufassir, right?
Yeah, and he was also, you can say,
he believed that God had a body of a 30-year-old.
Yep. And he also believed like God had hair, organs, like full on.
Yeah, sandals.
And it is said that he got this because he early on, like as a child, he would study with Jews. So they say he took a little bit from it. And then he was a teacher of Muhammad ibn Karam, who founded the Karamiyya. And these are all obviously different groups, and in the end it sort of converges on Ibn Taymiyyah, and you see the final result of that. But interestingly enough, my point is that the way Salafis like to present is so far from reality. I mean, all early sort of scholars said you shouldn't describe God improperly. Like they would refuse to describe God. They would say like, why are you like adding something to this? They would say, like, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah talks about the howness and the manner, right? Like you have to affirm the meaning and deny the howness.
Yes.
Like deny knowing the howness. And the scholars would say, like the earliest scholars would say, this is interpretation. This is tafsir. Like, like in a lot of early books, they would say like, no tafsir, no description. This is description. This is interpretation. This is like something they would condemn, in fact. Because this is a more like, it's a sort of a very sort of rudimentary but philosophical inquiry in dividing these things. What scholars meant, and this is clearer if you go back to like very early Aqidah works of like Abu Hanifa and others, like they talk about this, they say, do not translate. But like, why would they say do not translate, right? It doesn't make any sense in like the anthropomorphist view. The reason they say this is because when you translate, you necessarily ascribe a certain kind of meaning. So like you shouldn't say like Allah has a hand. You say Allah has a yad, and you don't know what this means. You don't know what the sentence means.
Is that your position?
No, I'm Ashari, but I think this is
But some of the early Asharis did this, right?
Yeah. So Imam al-Bayhaqi and others. So Ash'arism is kind of twofold. You have like Tawhid al-Mana and you have Tawhid, obviously. So some scholars were entirely Tawhidi and some scholars were more Tawhidi. But Salafis like to claim that, Ash'ari sort of got more misguided as time went on. So like all early scholars are like Tawhidi and then, they got more and more Tawhid. But I don't find this to be the case. Like some early scholars were doing a lot more Tawhid than some of the later ones. So it's really like a sort of twofold.
I have more respect for Tafweed al-Ma'ana, but I still think it becomes problematic in an intellectual setting because Tafweed al-Ma'ana is basically turns these statements into like non-cognitive statements. So you're not really like declaring. So as a personal pious thing, I think it's fine, right? Like as an individual personal approach. But I think in the realm of intellectual and theological dialectic, it's not a tenable position because you're basically I believe God has X. What's X? I don't know.
Yeah, I get what you mean, and this is what even I think Imam Ahmad talked about. You know that there is a small opinion narrated from Imam Ahmad that he actually allowed a form of kalam. I think Abu Yala talks about this. So Abu Yala cites a narration from him. Again, this is like most Hanbalis.
Yeah, Abu Yala believed in a praiseworthy kind of kalam, right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah. So he would say like, like I think in a discourse type of situation, I personally like do not have like a straight sort of preference towards one method towards the other. Obviously, as all scholars, I consider Tawhid al-Mana like personally safe. But if you're pushed, if you're in a type of discussion, certainly you can do Tawhid. And, if it's done properly, no issue in that. Just you have to make sure, obviously, that, what you do is within the bounds. And obviously, like when you do Tawhid, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. Like there's linguistics, context. You don't want to like give a wrong meaning to it, right? So it should be done by professionals. That's what our scholars say.
Yeah, I understand that, and again, as I said, in the realm of theological debate, dialogue, I think Tawil is very important. I don't think Tafweed al-Mahna is a tenable thing, but as an individual, like if you're not involved in theology, right, and you're just like a believer, then I think Tafweed, is fine. I don't think it's a problem, right? But what I really think is problematic is what the Salafis do. Like affirming a meaning and then just saying, well, we don't know the modality. I mean, this is just, to me, this is, it results in either crass anthropomorphism, right? Or just straight up contradiction. God has a real literal hand, but it's not a hand.
Yeah, I mean, our scholars talked about this, right?
It's a completely contradictory statement, and this is, I think, frankly, it is important that they are reminded of this over and over, because the Salafis today are the most, dominant vocal Muslim group on the internet.
On the internet,
yeah, on the internet, not in real. Well, real life is another thing. They're well funded, but they're the most vocal Muslim group on the internet, and they're frankly the most offensive. Like they go around, picking fights with everybody, just virtually every other Muslim group, and they are the ones. At least this is a recent thing. I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I feel like we're now seeing the fourth wave of Salafism, which I call neo-Salafism, where again, I don't know what you think, but my observation is there's a neo-Salafi movement where they continue to be Salafi, but they do some taqiyya. So when they talk to Christians and and agnostics and atheists and whatever Hindus, they do taqiyya, like they don't actually share these interpretations, and instead they actually copy paste some philosophical arguments which technically they're not allowed to use, and they use it, and then
Mhm.
they bring in the actual Salafi hermeneutics a bit later.
Oh,
This is-
absolutely. I witnessed this. I mean, obviously, I think Salafis are a diverse group, right? So there are different kinds of people among them. Some of them are even completely fine. Mufti Menk is technically a Salafi, right? But no, I mean, fine as in general, right? Like you have a spectrum here. But for people doing like this kind of sort of a form of deception, I did witness it. I've seen it. The Salafis also have this weird obsession, like where they are sort of acting like Jehovah's Witnesses sometimes. Like they would stalk up new reverts and try to like goad them into like becoming Salafi. So I witnessed only them doing that. Like all other Sunnis are like study it at your own pace, and they're like. But I think Salafis, the way they approach this stuff, like being sort of secretive about their beliefs, or not being clear cut about them, or trying to sort of like switch topic to things where they know they can say something of some learned arguments they learned from somewhere. That's absolutely true. I think that certainly happens. I wouldn't say every Salafi does this, but a lot of them do. To be honest, I find it interesting that today they're sort of taking inspiration from a lot of them modern, they're not even Salafis. Some of them are switched already to a more Taimi kind of view, right? If you get me. Because what Ibn Taymiyyah would held is different from Salafism. Ibn Taymiyyah himself was probably Tabji Salafis. So not his position in attributes, they are actually the same in this regard, almost. But
yeah, I think they have the same like hermeneutics, it seems.
Yeah, it depends where. Like, I'll give an example here, and Salafis wouldn't agree with this probably. It depends which ones, right? Like, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah held a Mu'tazili view on divine speech.
It seems like I know what you mean, but
Yeah.
it seems like a Karami view.
Oh, I don't know. I heard like he's sort of. I know he
It's
has
a Karami view actually, because like he says that the God eternally has the ability to speak. That's just an ability, right? And then the speech act itself, which is sounds and letters, Ibn Taymiyyah says that inheres within God.
Yeah, but God originates it within him, like. So.
Yeah. He so it's the divine speech, the uttered speech is hadith.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's what the Karamiya believe. Like they believe that every action of God was originated in time, right? But inherent within God's essence. Whereas the Mu'tazila believe that every action of God is hadith, but it inheres outside of God.
Yeah. No, I know the distinction. It's just the fact that it's originated.
I just feel like the Taymiyan view of the Quran is more like the Karami view.
Yeah, I didn't know Karamis held the same thing. I thought this was sort of like Ibn Taymiyyah's
so there's an interesting description by your Imam Juwayni, right, in Kitab al-Irshad.
Oh, yeah.
And he describes the Karami view, which is basically what the Ibn Taymiyyah believes on divine speech, and Juwayni says this is outside the pale of religion. Like he says it's kufr, basically.
Yeah. Their positions on Ibn Taymiyyah, I'll say his fiqh is quite good. Like everyone agrees, even the modern like Hanbalis agrees that his fiqh is good. Generally, like there are some exceptions, but even I remember reading his teacher. Like his teacher used to say, I saw nur or like real light from him when I was teaching him fiqh, but not when I was teaching him Aqidah. So, Ibn Taymiyyah did get certain kind of inspirations from different sources, so that's, I think, undeniable. Like for one, he took inspiration to an extent from Ibn Rushd. That's very well known. He even defended him. So,
Yeah, I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah seems pretty eclectic. I mean, there's even some Mu'tazili-ish ideas he had on morality.
So
Ibn Sina ideas on God creating for eternity. You know,
I think these days you see a lot of sort of Salafi intellectuals switching into more Taymiyyah understanding of things, because Ibn Taymiyyah at least tried to philosophize somewhat what he believed in. He tried to bring in arguments, and he approved of intellectual inquiry. So for Salafis, they, for them this is like a way out, out of a lot of contradiction. And modern days, I actually find some of these Salafis adopting certain positions from within Western academia, like
yes,
some
analytic Salafi
yeah,
analytic philosophy, which is like the biggest oxymoron in the world.
yeah,
No,
like
I make fun of them for this all the time because it's completely inconsistent. Like the Salafis want to say that Mu'tazila, Ibn Sina, oh, this is bid'ah, this is foreign. But modern Western analytic philosophy and theology, oh, that is fine, apparently. It's the
especially
biggest like hypocrisy I've ever seen.
especially they like some of these more like Protestant Salafis, because some of the
Yes,
Protestant
they do.
theologians
Yep.
had this similar ideas. So.
They do. I mean, the latest fad now is that God is temporal.
Man.
And that time is a sifa, an attribute of God. This is something that I've seen some of these people just pick up uncritically from Protestant theologians who like the idea of a changing God,
Yeah. I mean,
But
that's
anyway, my
just.
friend, I have to actually
Oh,
end the stream. It's like super late here.
right.
It's a good chatting with you. Obviously, even if we don't agree on everything, it's
Yeah,
still
absolutely,
a nice
absolutely.
chat. Always fun to hear about your impressions of the Salafis and whatever else is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. It was nice as well. I'll be leaving. Bye.
All right, take care. Salam alaikum.
Bye.
All right, so that's it. That was our first stream. I think we went almost to 2 hours. Mr. Caffey, there's somebody in the backstage, but I have to end the stream, so maybe you'll join us next time. Take care. I'll leave this up here, like on the channel, and we'll try to do this again soon.